The Artist, Time of Stillness, Year 3. It was made of a single bit of polished bone, or something that was bone-like. The surface felt strongly of something more tactile, though, stretchy and spongy. And it was surprisingly small, and outside of the hideous engravings of unspeakable happenings, could easily have been mistaken for most any other instrument. Zhao couldn't help but feel mildly disappointed. A while ago, a list of infernal hits to burn the time away had been delivered, possibly as an accompanying gift. It hadn't arrived through a hellish portal, but instead been dropped from a great height by a black bird, circling high above. The heavy book had careened off a nearby tree branch, tumbled through the air and impaled Bones in the earth in a way that would have been pretty horrific, if it hadn't been Bones, and it hadn't been a book. The delivery bird hadn't even shown any remorse at all, just made this awful, kind of choking laughter that sounded far more unpleasant than it had the right to. Still, it was a present, so they had to do something with it, and Zhao had placed the tome of songs up between two rocks, and the horn on top of it, which had the effect of making the place look like a shrine to the dark musical impulses within, which it might be. Occasionally, he had seen Zembi look at it, too. One of them was going to play the darn thing. This wasn't good. Zhao could feel the itch, deep and numb within him. Sure, it'd be pointless. But how many people honestly got to say that they had blown an infernal horn from a realm sideways entirely to their own? Here he was, in a cavern that had been painted over, with pretty underground houses and vast gardens around him. There were fellow humans, and his friends, and even with some of the dangers here, life seemed pleasant enough. But the houses were empty, and ultimately they were alone. And when their time was up, and more than ever, Zhao felt everyone was going to make it out okay, they had to, after all this, it would all just cease to be. Disappear? Not knowing felt like a void in the back of his mind, one that drew in all the little pleasantries of the day. Was all that they did pointless? Sure, you could ask that of anyone, of any life, but somehow, to think of his new friends, gone. And then what? Would anyone back home, still even be alive? Still remember him?
Zhao, do you have a moment? It seems we have a visitor.
Bones had been watching him for some time, probably. It was weird. Maybe it was unfair to the old skeleton, how close he had gotten. Zhao didn't always like how much he relied on his friends, how much he depended on them. Not because he doubted them. Quite the opposite. In his heart, he kind of believed that Bones and Zembi were capable of anything. It was more complex than that. A nagging, sorrowful kind of pang that asked if it was all right to view Bones so closely, if in a way, love and charity weren't weights on the back of someone so old, and so long-lived. But if they were, well, Bones never showed it, did he?
A visitor, hey? Well, I guess I can't stand around here trying to figure out what sort of sound a blasphemous horn makes, can I? Do you think we should do anything special, or? Well, I did set out some nice, flat stones for plates. But that turned out to be rather unnecessary. Hum.
Bones chuckled to himself, skull rattling in amusement. Curiosity overcame melancholy, as it often does, and a confident grin returned to Chao's lips. Although the underground apartments around them weren't inhabited at the moment, they had really come to life since the whole thing had been a dream a few years ago. From solid stone and rock-jutted roofs, colored in rich reds and yellows, polished stone giving the illusion of rich paint where they'd had to improvise. Sometimes, the three of them would randomly pick one to camp out in, staring up at the cragless ceiling and telling stories when it was too dark for any further work, as the lights of deep plants shone and twinkled around them. Other times, Zhao would just come down here to admire their handiwork and think to himself, "This is real. This is something we did." And it surprised him how often the thought made him smile. That, at least, would stay with him, for as long as he was alive, no less. In the main hall, Lorelei and Zembi were playing some sort of weird card game. Weird because he recognized maybe 1 out of every 10 cards, they'd clearly been scavenged from all sorts of places, and if there were rules to it, they weren't any rules he knew. Lorelei was parked next to a large, cast-iron box. It looked incredibly sturdy, or as if it had been incredibly sturdy once. All sorts of straps and bits of rope had been tied haphazardly across the box to keep it from collapsing through whatever journeys Lorelei took to get to wherever she went. He didn't understand the half of it, but it sounded spooky, magical, and pretty cool. Feeling like it'd be rude to interrupt, Zhao took a seat on the floor, and Bones followed his example, still looking mildly amused. It was interesting to see the way that his skull shook when he tried to contain laughter. What made him a very poor liar was also one of the ways he ended up feeling like a fantastic friend. Bones was someone you ended up knowing would be honest with you. And, no matter how badly he was trying to keep something a secret, sometimes a poor liar was nice to have around as a skilled one. The game seemed to be in its darkest hour. Zambi didn't sweat, exactly, though she did sometimes have some kind of resin-y secretion that was basically sweat, but at least smelled kind of like pine soap. Well, the point was that Zambi seemed to be in trouble, because she was not exactly sweating up a storm and trying to avoid glancing at her hand. Zhao carefully moved around the two without getting up, entirely aware that it was obvious he was trying to get a look at their hands. Lorelei seemed amused, but in the heat of the battle, and Zambi was too focused to do much more than stammer a hello. As for her hand, he got glimpses of normal cards, mostly in the suite of spades, a few hearts, one club, but no diamonds at all. And there were other cards, one that seemed to be some kind of fearsome monster, and another which seemed to be some kind of weird card in a foreign tongue, possibly talking about the history of a natural monument. It seemed to have a picture of some impressive chasm, at least. Where from, he could say he had no clue.
Zams. Zayams.
Zhao whispered through clenched teeth. This wasn't gonna work the way he wanted to work.
Try using,
Zambi slowly tilted her head to face him, and mouthed, with odd, practiced silence, or perhaps horror.
I've got no clue what I'm doing.
As it turned out, even though her laughter was kind of creaky and a bit too cheerful to sound really, seriously why, Lorelei didn't know what she was doing either, or seemed not too inclined to care. She declared an armistice under the auspices of everyone who played, one, that seemed to suit Zambi just fine, even though Zhao wanted to know how you won or lost in the game, why there were tiny orbs of glass that got put on cards, and when you rolled the die. If you rolled the die.
Sorry for taking so long. I just wasn't sure if you were busy, and felt it might not be a bad idea to entertain Miss Zambi.
Zambi looked incredibly proud at the unnecessary title, folding her arms behind her back and smiling unevenly.
So, I decided that we'd play a game of cards. Only, I didn't actually have enough cards with me to play anything, so we kind of improvised. It turned out pretty great. Well, it could have gone better for me, sure. But next time, I've got a surefire plan to win.
Placing her fingers against the chunk of stone that Bones had patiently polished until it resembled a fine, if archaic, table, Zambi chortled proudly.
It's a secret, though, so you'll have to come back and play again. Well, a witch ends up being pretty busy. Can't say I'd miss it for the world. So. This isn't something you have to return or anything, but Ruslana and I felt it'd be nice to start trading. So that it'd feel kind of like we were actual settlements.
Lorelei whistled to herself, playing with the brim of her hat, before she peeled off one of the various strips of rope across the iron container. And it exploded open, depositing all sorts of strange materials and ruined objects on the ground. Lorelei's quiet yelp of surprise, or perhaps of embarrassment, made it seem like she had expected a bit more longevity from the box, but given how much had been crammed into it and how ancient it looked, maybe it was just lucky it had lasted this far. Coughing nervously, Lorelei brushed dust from her shoulder and tilted her hat up. Her eyes were bright and her smile wide.
Well, it's not much, but Ruslana wanted to send a lot of useful stuff, and I thought it'd probably be more fun if there was as much not immediately useful stuff, because it might be kind of cool to see what you all built with it, so. Do you all like it?
But Zhao was already on his feet, arms raised into the air.
This is awesome.
He hadn't meant to yell, but There were rusted spigots and broken fans, mechanical belts that might have served better to keep the box shut, then scattered on the ground in front of them, jars of mysterious substance that might have been jam or possibly dye, and it didn't matter, because they could be used for something. Lorelei's smile was as wide as it could possibly be, excitement visible in the way her fingers tapped anxiously against her legs and the glint in her eyes.
Yes. Victory, ahaha. Well, we were thinking of building roads, so maybe you've got plans as well? I mean, they don't need to be so serious as all that, but anything would be kind of cool.
Excitedly, the two talked for some time. Zhao hadn't realized how long it had been since he had had the time to work on real projects, and with the possibility of roads like back home, and semi-constant supply runs. All sorts of things became possible. Windmills and statues strung with lights and decorations that wavered in the breeze. Landmarks commemorating the stories that they had left behind them on the island, great buildings and carvings into the world itself, so that even as the island changed, there'd be some memory of what they had done, and what they had meant to one another. Of course, once they had cleared the scrap and artistic junk away, there were a lot more carefully prepared things. Plates, forks, various domestic conveniences Zhao had long since started to take for granted. To be honest, they were a little unnecessary. It was already kind of weird eating with Zambi and Bones, after all. Still, he could drum a nice tune over the table with them, so that was a plus.
Well, if you've got any questions, I can answer them, but I guess that means we're officially trading partners now. So please feel free to send over any extra unnecessary stuff you have, I guess, if you want to. Her eyes shut, Lorelei looked incredibly content, as if everything had went far better than she could have expected or hoped, and perhaps it had. But, Zhao wasn't certain they had anything of value to trade. Well, prettying up places was easy enough, and he had plans for monuments and structures, but you couldn't put a deadline on art. Well, you could, but it was a quick way to put a deadline on failure. Sure, they could pass on some of Zambi's fungus, or maybe do repairs or help contribute, but weren't they basically just being given this stuff for free? Is it really okay to accept this? Zhao finally murmured, trying to hide how uncomfortable he was at having received a literal, demonic instrument, user's guide, and load of free stuff in rapid succession. Yes. It's really okay. Again, if you think of something you want to send our way, I sure wouldn't turn it down, but you've got some time to mull that over. I can't imagine it'll take us too long to tamp down the land, though. Lorelei's eyes sparkled, and it was clear she was thinking of the future. Zhao clucked his tongue, and tried to feel grateful, and he was. But sometimes, charity overwhelms and attacks as much as any moment's discourtesy. A strange, unpleasant feeling that ends up walling over gratitude and building citadels of the heart. Zhao tried to smile, but couldn't quite manage one. Hey, that's really great. Well, we'll probably need some time to think about all the stuff we're going to be doing, so. Thankfully, either Lorelei didn't notice or was too tactful to say, perhaps both. She simply smiled, and wished them all well, and then disappeared as if the caverns themselves were just a suggestion, and she a trick of the light. Zhao placed his palm to his temple and shut his eyes. Are you okay? He didn't answer Zambi at first, because he was desperately trying to figure out why no, he wasn't. Sure, he was grateful, and happy. Lorelei was cool, Ruslana was cool but kind of intimidating. He was glad to be friends with them, and much more glad to not be enemies. This was awesome. A chance to do something good. Something real, something long-lasting. Why, then, did this gnawing pit in his stomach feel like some kind of fever dream? Not every waking moment was supposed to feel like it was caught between being a trap and a challenge, and friendship shouldn't feel forced. I don't think I am, Zams. Zhao whispered, opening his eyes just enough to glance at the pile of junk behind them. It was wonderful, and filled with things that had been selected at random, but with great care. Useful bits of lost metal, shaped like torn flowers, the red, watchful gaze of a sign, long since lost to the world. So why did it make him feel this way? Do you need some time to be alone?
Bones murmured quietly, and from the corner of his view he could see the skeleton already trying to glance at Zambi, who had gotten quite used to being touchy-feely and was hovering around Zhao with a mixture of concern and confusion. She was right to be confused, though. He was confused, himself.
No. Please don't go. I really love you guys. I don't want to be alone, feeling like this. It doesn't feel like me. I don't like it.
Zhao didn't realize he was whispering, and certainly hadn't meant to tear up. What the heck, man? He tried to bring himself up, to force back happiness with a smile and a laugh and a good idea, but they wouldn't come. No, weirder than that. It felt like the feeling was stealing over his memories, too. That was what they were, some place to drop off unusable equipment in the hope of returned favors? That was fine, why should it get you down? Come on, you're making your friends worry. But his inner voice, the man he knew he was, got drowned out by a sea of strange white noise. Instead, he could hear much tinier voices, needling and pathetic. They were very ordered and emphatic in their demands, each one wanting something else of him, some tiny task or favor. Was this a side effect of losing the ability to feel? Was he going to just start feeling like this, forever? The idea terrified him, and he refused to accept it. Taking several deep breaths, Zhao rose to his feet and tried to smile but failed for the second time. Still, even if you can't force happiness, you can fight unhappiness. That much, he knew.
Would it be okay, guys, would you mind joining me for a walk? Think I need some fresh air. Maybe that caves are getting to me.
Now that he had opened his eyes again, he was instantly aware of two things. The splitting headache he didn't quite feel but was aware he had, and the fact that neither Bones nor Zambi had left his side.
Of course. Walks are my middle name, except I'm pretty sure I only have the one name.
Zambi announced defiantly, as if her voice could charge in and cut through the melancholy he was feeling. And maybe it could. Most of the time.
I wouldn't mind that, myself. But you shouldn't force yourself to do anything, Zhao. You do realize it's all right to not know why you're experiencing something that we won't. Yeah, of course. It's not that, though. I promise. Do you ever just feel like beyond the edge of your vision there's something, and if you don't see it, something really bad will happen, or...
Zhao interrupted, trying to explain the heavy weight he felt against his shoulders. Bones did not reply. He had lived through many, many seasons, after all, more than enough to know that even if he felt the exact same way that young Zhao did, it wouldn't feel like empathy at the moment. So instead, the old skeleton took Zhao's hand, and the two headed towards the distant, natural light above. Zambi watched them go, almost silently. It wasn't the time or place, but once again she wanted to congratulate herself on her incredible skill at espionage. Once she was certain that Bones had shepherded Zhao away, the plant girl leapt back into the pile of stuff and dug through it with a determined, if a little uneven-keeled expression. There was nothing in it that seemed particularly ominous, though, no ancient artifacts, or even artifacts, of dark and forgotten powers, or beacons of momentary unpleasantness. There wasn't even any really much besides the silverware that was complete enough to look like it might have stirred up unpleasant memories. Had that been it, maybe? Zambi held a spoon up into the air, pressing it against her eye. Not literally, of course, but close enough to stop it from moving around. Darn it, couldn't she stay still just this once? There had to be some secret here, some vile energy in the thing, right? Right. But, like all the rest, it was just a piece of metal used for eating. Sighing, Zambi threw it over her shoulder and fell to the ground for a moment's dejection. Maybe it was just how things were supposed to be. Maybe it was natural for people to lose hope after a while, and maybe there were some things that even friendship couldn't fix. But she had known that. What was terrifying to her, what she couldn't understand, was it possible for friendship to cause feelings like this, sometimes?
Too serious. Way, too serious, ah ha ha ha.
Laughing to herself, but not really feeling it, Zambi got up, did a few stretches and dashed out to join her friends. She wasn't going to do them any good here, after all. Then, she dashed back in, or perhaps briskly jogged. There was something she needed, after all. Outside, the weather had begun to drizzle lightly, the pleasant sort of light rain that heralds a coming storm, or at the very least a coming series of rains, mild to severely more light than the previous ones. Zhao was looking up into them with that weird look on his face, the one he had taken on more and more recently. It was glassy and far-eyed and didn't suit him at all, and the rain kept on falling and he didn't seem to notice or care. Well, if he couldn't feel the chill, that was a little victory at least. Or possibly really dangerous, since it meant he also probably couldn't realize how cold and miserable it was. Geez.
Oh, Zambi. We were just, HRMN. Well.
Bones began, and then stopped just as quickly. They had been at Herm, well, then. She had wasted too much time.
Ciao.
Zambi yelled, wishing that the rain were a little more dramatic than a light drizzle, but that couldn't be helped. Spreading her, kind of tiny, fine, it was the gesture that mattered anyway, arms out against the falling rain, Zambi did her best to avoid shaking as she spoke. Not because she wanted to stay still, but because it felt like something that'd make her words sound more important.
Snap. Out. Of. IT.
Bones looked as mortified as a skeleton possibly could. Of all the ways to resolve conflicts he had seen over his many years of existence, this one almost never ended well. That being said, Zambi was as loud and cacophonous as an entire hive of bells buzz, and from the way his jaw was hanging he knew he was literally incapable of intervening. Literally, because he'd have to snap it back into place. Feebly attempting to do so before Zambi could make things any worse, the old man felt as if he was watching from a great distance, and in very slow motion, as Zhao turned his face, drenched from the sky above, and turned to stare at Zambi in blank confusion.
What? You're acting really weird, and IT isn't like you, and I don't like IT.
And then, Zambi threw the book at him.
Infernal hits to burn the time away
spiraled through the air, quickly becoming waterlogged and falling to the ground limply. In other words, it failed completely to hit its intended target, but that was okay, she hadn't wanted to actually hit him. She did feel moderately bad about the image of the infernal saxophone player discolored by mud and rainwater on the cover, but then again, he was a saxophonist. Zhao began to laugh, and at first, Bones was certain that everything had gone as terribly as it possibly could. Then, Zhao wiped the rain and tears from his own eyes, and leaned into a very awkward and kind of faltering hug. Bones was certain that he was getting more frail, and stranger still he couldn't tell why. But that didn't matter, right now. Because Zhao was smiling, really smiling, and still laughing even though he had meant to actually read or at least thumb through infernal hits at some point and it was now sort of ruined.
Thanks, Zams. Thanks, Bones. I'm not sure what happened. I just...
Zhao stretched his arms up towards the sky, catching the rain against himself.
Don't mention it. Healing people's hearts through unyielding and constant interference is what I do best. That's a little arrogant. I think you'll find that it was actually my quiet wisdom that helped in this occasion and... Aha. But I didn't see it, so it probably didn't happen.
Zambi smirked in success, and Bones had to concede that her logic was sound as could be expected of any freewheeling plant girl, at the very least.
So, then... Zhao. Do you feel a bit more centered? Do you want... Yeah.
Zhao nodded, and they moved under the shadow of a large tree, the frosting blue leaves providing a pleasant canopy.
I think there's some part of me that doesn't like how we're retracing all these old steps. I mean, not you and me, I mean. We're doing a lot of stuff that's kind of... I don't know. If I had to pick a word for it, I'd call it sketchy.
The three nodded in unison. Actually, Bones had no clue what sketch was meant to imply, since they had been doing an awful lot of art, and weren't sketches a good thing? But Zemby was very hip, and understood the differences between good sketching and sketch behavior, or at least pretended to. She was very good at looking serious.
Maybe it's just that, but I think there's something else, too. I feel like we're kind of dependent on the kindness of strangers. That's okay. I like being helped by people, but I also like helping people. It's weird. It doesn't feel right not being able to do that really. So I guess what I'm saying is...
The rain around them began to pick up, though Zhao felt annoyed it was a mild drizzle still, and not a dramatically howling wind with fierce droplets of frozen rain.
Let's do some art.
Chapter end.